When I woke up to find my husband's best friend in my bed, the air in the room felt heavier than any silence I'd ever known. What happens when the boundaries of trust blur and one night changes everything? Follow this story to uncover how one moment of weakness spiraled into an unforgettable tale of desire, betrayal, and consequence. Subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. When I woke up to find my husband's best friend in bed beside me, the silence in the room felt heavier than the betrayal that was yet to unfold. The dim light from the bedside lamp barely illuminated his face, but the closeness of his presence was suffocating. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, wondering if I was still dreaming. But no, the warmth of his arm barely grazing mine was real, and so was the cold wave of panic washing over me. Rewind to a few weeks earlier. My husband, David, had insisted his best friend, Derek, stay with us while his apartment underwent renovations. "It's just temporary," David had said, flashing his usual reassuring smile. I nodded because what else could I do? Derek was practically family, having been David's closest friend since college. He was charming in a way that made people gravitate toward him. I liked him, but only from a safe distance. Our home was an elegant yet comfortable two-story in the suburbs, with enough space to ensure privacy, even for guests. Derek moved into the guest bedroom on the ground floor, bringing with him an air of easy confidence that immediately filled the house. He was polite, helpful even, offering to fix the dripping kitchen faucet on his first day. But there was something about him, his sly humor, the way his gaze lingered a second too long, that set me on edge. The first week passed uneventfully. David was, as always, busy with work, leaving early and returning late. I spent my days managing the household, catching up on my reading, and convincing myself that the flickers of attention I felt from Derek were figments of my imagination. One evening, after David had left for an overnight business trip, Derek and I shared a bottle of wine on the back patio. The air was cool, and the stars were impossibly bright. He leaned back in his chair, casually swirling the red liquid in his glass. "You ever feel like life just stagnates?" he asked, his voice soft, almost contemplative. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Sometimes, I suppose. Why?" He looked at me then, his dark eyes steady. "I just get the sense that you're not as happy as you let on." His words hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. "Everyone has their moments," I replied, keeping my tone light. But the truth lingered beneath my words, raw and unspoken. Derek didn't press further. Instead, he changed the subject, regaling me with a funny story from their college days. I laughed, grateful for the shift in tone, but a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen through me. The night I woke to find Derek in my bed was supposed to be like any other. I'd gone to sleep early, exhausted from a day of errands. I don't know what stirred me from my sleep, but the moment I opened my eyes, my body went rigid. He wasn't touching me, not fully, but his proximity was undeniable. His voice broke the silence, low and apologetic. "I'm sorry, I thought this was the guest room." I blinked, trying to process his words. "Derek, what are you doing?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. He sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I must have been half asleep. I swear I didn't mean to." He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze meeting mine. "I'll go." But he didn't move right away. Instead, he lingered for a moment too long, his eyes searching mine. My heart raced for reasons I couldn't fully understand or admit. Finally, he stood and left, the door clicking softly behind him. The next morning, I avoided him, pretending to be engrossed in a book as he moved about the house. But the air between us felt charged, as if last night's moment had opened a door neither of us was willing to fully close. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, painting golden streaks across the countertop where I mechanically stirred my coffee. Derek appeared, freshly showered and composed, his usual charm firmly in place. "Morning," he said, flashing a disarming smile that might have seemed harmless if not for the memory of last night. I muttered a curt "morning" and busied myself with cleaning an already spotless counter. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me with an easy confidence that made my chest tighten. "About last night," he began, and I stiffened, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I really am sorry. I was half asleep and—" Let's not," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "It's fine. Let's just forget about it." For a moment, he looked like he might push back, but then he nodded. "If that's what you want." His tone was light, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something unreadable, that made my stomach churn. The day dragged on, the tension between us lingering like a storm cloud. Derek spent most of the afternoon outside, tinkering with the garden hose that had been leaking for weeks. I stayed inside, pretending to be engrossed in a novel, but every time I glanced out the window, I found myself watching him. He worked shirtless in the sun, his back muscles flexing with each movement, and I hated myself for noticing. By the time David called that evening, my nerves were frayed. "Hey, how's everything?" he asked, his voice warm and familiar. "Fine," I said, forcing cheerfulness into my tone. "Derek's been helpful. He fixed the garden hose." "Sounds like he's earning his keep," David said with a laugh. "I'll be home tomorrow afternoon, so maybe we can all have dinner together." "Sure," I said, my throat tightening at the thought of sitting across from Derek with David beside me. "That sounds nice." After hanging up, I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened television screen. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that amplified every thought, every memory. I couldn't stop replaying the look in Derek's eyes last night, the way he'd lingered, the unspoken weight of it. A part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but another part of me, part I wasn't proud of, felt something else entirely. A thrill. A forbidden spark I had no business feeling. Derek came in just as I was considering retreating to my room for the night. "Wine?" he asked, holding up a bottle with a mischievous grin. I figured we could celebrate my excellent handyman skills. I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming to decline, but the loneliness that had been gnawing at me for weeks whispered a different answer. "Sure," I said, my voice barely audible. We sat on the patio again, the night air cool and crisp. The wine flowed easily, loosening the tension between us. Derek was his usual charming self, recounting stories from his travels and making me laugh despite myself. For a moment, it felt almost normal, almost harmless. But then his tone shifted. "You know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "David's lucky to have you." The compliment caught me off guard, and I looked away, focusing on the stars above. "We're lucky to have each other," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I mean it," he continued, his voice low. "You're incredible. The way you hold everything together, the way you—" He stopped, shaking his head as if chastising himself. "Forget it." "What?" I asked, my voice softer now, laced with a curiosity I couldn't suppress. He hesitated, his gaze meeting mine. I don't think David realizes how lucky he is, how much he has with you. The air between us felt heavy, charged. I set my glass down, my hands trembling slightly. Derek, you shouldn't. I know, he interrupted, his voice raw. I know I shouldn't say these things, but I can't help it. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. You deserve to be seen, really seen. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the stone patio. I think it's time we called it a night. He stood too, his expression regretful but unwavering. Of course, good night. His voice was calm, but his eyes held a storm. I fled to my room, closing the door behind me and leaning against it, my heart racing. His words echoed in my mind, stirring emotions I didn't want to face. Was it wrong to feel flattered, to feel seen, as he put it? Or was it simply human nature to crave validation, even from the wrong person? Sleep came in fitful bursts, my dreams a chaotic tangle of guilt and longing. When morning finally came, I woke with a sense of dread, knowing David would be home soon. I resolved to push the events of the past 2 days into a box, lock it, and throw away the key. Derek and I could coexist without incident. We had to. But as I stepped into the kitchen, the sight of Derek standing there pouring coffee made my resolve falter. He looked up, offering a small smile. "Morning." "Morning," I replied, my voice clipped. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I pulled away quickly, avoiding his gaze. David arrived that afternoon, his presence a comforting reminder of normalcy. He greeted Derek with his usual warmth, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. We had dinner together, the 3 of us, and for the most part, it was pleasant. But every so often I caught Derek watching me, his gaze heavy with something I didn't want to name. As the days turned into weeks, Derek's stay stretched longer than anticipated. The renovations on his apartment hit delays, leaving him with no choice but to remain with us. The tension between us became an unspoken thing, a silent undercurrent that neither of us dared to address. But it couldn't last forever. One evening, as David worked late and I sat reading in the living room, Derek walked in. He sat across from me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. I set my book down, my heart pounding. "About what?" "About this," he said, gesturing vaguely between us. "I can't keep pretending nothing happened, that night." "Stop," I said, cutting him off. "There's nothing to talk about. It was a mistake, a misunderstanding." "Was it?" he asked, leaning forward, his eyes piercing. "Because it didn't feel like a mistake to me." I stared at Derek, the weight of his words making it hard to breathe. His gaze was steady, unflinching, but I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. "It doesn't matter what it felt like," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was a mistake, one we need to forget." He leaned back in the chair, his jaw tightening. "Forget? Is that really what you want?" "Yes," I said quickly, though the conviction in my voice wavered. He studied me for a long moment, the silence between us stretching thin. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but you can't lie to me. I see it, you know, the way you look at me, the way you've been avoiding me." "That's enough," I said sharply, standing up. My legs felt unsteady, but I forced myself to hold my ground. "I don't know what you think you're seeing, but whatever it is, it ends here." Now. Derek stood too, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that my resolve threatened to crumble. "You don't have to be afraid," he said softly, his voice low and coaxing. "I'm not here to hurt you. I can't pretend I don't care about you." "You don't care about me," I snapped, stepping back. "You're just lonely, and I'm convenient." He flinched as though I'd slapped him, but he didn't back down. "Is that what you think? That you're just some passing distraction?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions I didn't want to acknowledge. Finally, I turned and fled the room, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as though it could shield me from the storm brewing in my chest. The next day, I made a point of avoiding Derek entirely. I busied myself with errands, chores, anything that would keep me out of the house. By the time I returned that evening, David was already home, his cheerful presence a stark contrast to the tension that had been suffocating me. "Long day?" he asked as I set down the grocery bags. "You could say that," I replied, forcing a smile. Derek appeared then, his expression unreadable, as he greeted David with the same easy charm he always displayed. But when his eyes met mine, I felt a flicker of something that sent my pulse racing, something that felt dangerously close to defiance. That night, as David worked in his study, I sat on the couch, pretending to watch television. Derek walked in, pausing in the doorway before stepping inside. He didn't sit, didn't speak. He simply stood there, his presence impossible to ignore. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice tired. "To talk," he said. His tone was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it that made me uneasy. "We've already said everything that needs to be said." "Have we?" he challenged, taking a step closer. "Because it doesn't feel that way to me." I sighed, setting down the remote. "Derek, I don't know what you expect from me, but whatever this is, it has to stop. I'm married, to your best friend, no less." "I know that," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "But that doesn't change how I feel, and it doesn't change the fact that I think you feel it too." "You don't know what I feel," I shot back, standing up. "You don't get to decide that for me." "Then tell me I'm wrong," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Tell me that what happened the other night meant nothing to you." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. My silence spoke volumes, and Derek took another step closer, his expression softening. "You don't have to say it. I already know." The sound of David's footsteps in the hallway shattered the moment, and I quickly stepped back, putting distance between us. Derek's composure returned in an instant, and by the time David entered the room, he was the picture of nonchalance. "Everything okay?" David asked, glancing between us. "Fine," I said quickly, my voice too bright. "We were just talking." David nodded, seemingly satisfied, and joined me on the couch. Derek excused himself, leaving the room with a casual wave. But the tension lingered, coiling tight in my chest as I sat beside my husband, his presence a stark reminder of the line I wouldn't cross. The following days were a blur of awkward silences and forced interactions. Derek seemed to sense my resolve and kept his distance, though I often caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. David remained blissfully unaware, his trust in both of us unshaken, but the weight of it all was becoming too much. One evening, as David worked late again, I found myself standing outside Derek's door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, hesitation warring with the restless energy that had been building inside me for weeks. Finally, I turned away, retreating to my room and collapsing onto the bed. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I had made my choice. I would protect my marriage, no matter what, but the guilt was suffocating. Guilt for the thoughts I couldn't control, for the emotions I couldn't suppress. Guilt for the moments I had let linger too long, for the lines I had come dangerously close to crossing. And yet, beneath the guilt there was something else, a longing I couldn't deny, a yearning for something I couldn't name. Was this a riddle? The days blurred together, each one an exercise in avoidance. I went out of my way to keep things normal, burying the tension between Derek and me beneath layers of forced politeness. But the harder I tried to suppress it, the more it seemed to bubble to the surface. It was in the way his gaze lingered on me during dinner, in the casual brush of his hand when passing me a dish. It was maddening, like a song stuck on a loop in my mind. David was oblivious, of course. He had always trusted Derek implicitly. And why wouldn't he? They'd been best friends for years, practically brothers. I envied his naivety. It allowed him to be at ease in a house that now felt like a minefield to me. Then came the evening that changed everything. David had left early for a late client dinner, promising to be back before midnight. I had been alone in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when Derek walked in. I tensed immediately, my body bracing for whatever unspoken tension he would bring with him. "I think we need to stop pretending," he said, skipping any pretense of small talk. I sighed, setting my phone down. "Derek, we've been over this. There's nothing to talk about." He stepped closer, his expression serious. "You can keep telling yourself that, but it doesn't make it true. You're not happy, and I can see it. I don't know why you stay in this house, in this marriage, pretending everything's fine." "That's enough," I snapped, standing up. "You don't know what you're talking about." I lifted the shirt. "Don't I?" he countered, his voice rising slightly. "I see the way he's never here, the way you light up when someone actually pays attention to you. You deserve more than this." I felt my resolve cracking under the weight of his words. "And you think you're the one who can give me that?" My voice was sharp, defensive, but there was a tremor beneath it. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I do." The silence that followed was deafening. My heart raced as I searched his face, desperate to find a way to diffuse the situation. But the truth was, part of me wanted to believe him. Part of me wanted to let go of the guilt and the fear and give in to the warmth I saw in his eyes. "I can't do this," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "You don't have to," he said softly, "but you need to stop lying to yourself. At least admit that there's something here, between us." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to throw his words back in his face and storm out of the room. But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come, and the weight of my silence hung in the air between us. Derek took a cautious step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. "I'm not trying to ruin your life," he said, his voice steady. I care about you. More than I should, maybe, but I can't help it." Tears pricked to the corners of my eyes, and I turned away, unwilling to let him see me like this. "You need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Please." He didn't argue. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, but then I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. The sound of his bedroom door closing echoed in the silence, and I finally let the tears fall. The next morning, Derek was gone. David didn't seem particularly surprised when he came home and found Derek's room empty. "He probably got tired of waiting for his apartment to be ready," he said with a shrug. "You know how he is. Can't sit still for too long." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, that sounds like him." But the truth was, his absence left a strange void. I had spent so much energy trying to avoid him, trying to suppress the feelings he stirred in me, that I didn't know how to exist without the tension. The house felt quieter, emptier. I told myself it was a good thing, that his leaving would give me the space I needed to refocus on my marriage. But late at night, when David was asleep and the house was silent, I found myself replaying our conversations, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't told him to go. A week later, I received a text. "I'm sorry for everything. I just needed to say that. Take care of yourself." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. His name glared at me from the top of the message, a reminder of everything I had been trying to forget. I wanted to delete it, to erase the evidence and move on. But instead, I found myself typing a reply. "You don't need to apologize. I hope you're okay." I regretted sending it the moment I hit send, but there was no taking it back. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, and when his reply came, my stomach twisted. "I'm fine, just miss you, that's all." I didn't respond. I couldn't. But the message stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind like a ghost. I knew I should have blocked his number, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Part of me wanted to keep that door open, even if I never planned to walk through it. David and I fell back into our usual routine, but things were different. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it started, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. He was still kind, still attentive in his own way, but something had shifted. Maybe it was me. Maybe the weight of my guilt had changed the way I saw him. Or maybe it was the knowledge that I had been seen, truly seen, by someone else. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, David reached for my hand. I let him take it, but the gesture felt hollow, like we were playing parts in a script we no longer believed in. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "You just seem distracted lately. I know things have been busy, but if something's bothering you, you can tell me." I wanted to tell him. I wanted to spill everything, to lay my heart bare and beg for forgiveness. But the words caught in my throat, and all I could do was shake my head. "I'm fine," I said, "just tired, that's all." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, and in that moment I realized the truth. Even if I never confessed, even if Derek's name was never spoken again, what had happened would stay with me. It had already changed me, changed us, and there was no going back. The days turned into weeks, and the memory of Derek began to fade, at least on the surface. I threw myself into routines, determined to restore a sense of normalcy to my life and my marriage. David, ever patient, seemed to accept my insistence that I was just tired, just busy. He didn't push for answers, and for that, I was both grateful and heartbroken. But late at night, when the house was quiet and David's steady breathing filled the bedroom, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. The look in Derek's eyes that night in the living room, the text message I couldn't bring myself to delete. It all lingered, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then, one evening, as David and I sat at the dinner table, the silence between us was interrupted by a question I didn't expect. "Have you heard from Derek?" My fork froze midair, and I quickly lowered it, forcing myself to appear calm. "No," I lied. "Why?" He shrugged, taking a sip of his wine. "I tried calling him the other day, but he didn't pick up. I just wanted to check in, see how he's doing. He seemed off toward the end of his stay." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "Maybe he's just busy," I offered, keeping my tone light. "You know how he is, always on the move." David nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. "Yeah, I guess so." The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the tension in my chest refused to ease. For the first time, I wondered if David suspected something. Had he noticed the way Derek and I avoided each other in those last few days? Had he picked up on the tension I thought I'd hidden so well? The thought terrified me, but it also forced me to confront a truth I'd been avoiding. No matter how hard I tried to bury it, the shadow of what had happened, or almost happened, would always be there. It wasn't just Derek's presence that had disrupted my life. It was the way he had held up a mirror to my unhappiness, forcing me to confront the cracks I had ignored for years. A month after Derek left, David surprised me with a weekend getaway. "Just the two of us," he said, smiling, as he handed me a brochure for a cabin in the mountains. "I thought it might be nice to unplug for a bit, spend some time together." I nodded, the gesture automatic. "That sounds wonderful." The cabin was beautiful, nestled in a quiet clearing surrounded by pine trees. The air was crisp, and the sound of the nearby river was soothing. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. David seemed more relaxed, too, his usual work stress replaced by an easy warmth that reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with. On our second night there, as we sat by the fire, David reached for my hand. "I know things haven't been easy lately," he said, his voice gentle. "And I know I haven't always been around as much as I should be. But I want you to know that I love you. And whatever's been bothering you, we can get through it. Together." The sincerity in his voice was like a knife to my chest. He didn't know the full extent of what he was offering to forgive, but his words still carried the weight of absolution. Tears filled my eyes, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I love you too," I said, my voice trembling. And I meant it. Despite everything, I did love him. But love, I was beginning to realize, wasn't always enough to erase the mistakes we made or the truths we hid from ourselves. Back home, life resumed its familiar rhythm, but the trip to the cabin had shifted something between us. David seemed more present, more attentive, and I tried my best to reciprocate. I wanted to rebuild what we had, to prove to myself that the cracks Derek had exposed didn't have to define us. But some nights, when the world was still, I found myself thinking of Derek, not with longing, but with a kind of bittersweet ache. He had been a catalyst, a storm that swept through my life and left it irrevocably changed. And while I wished things had been different, I couldn't deny that his presence had forced me to confront truths I might have otherwise ignored. Months later, as I was cleaning out an old drawer, I came across the text thread with Derek. My thumb hovered over his name, and for a moment I considered deleting it, but instead I opened the messages, scrolling through the brief exchange. "I'm fine. Just miss you, that's all." The words still carried a weight that made my chest tighten, but I knew they belonged to another life, a life I had chosen not to pursue. With a deep breath, I deleted the thread, feeling a strange sense of closure as I did. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, I reached for his hand. He stirred slightly, his fingers curling around mine as he murmured something in his sleep. The warmth of his touch grounded me, reminding me of the choice I had made, the life I had chosen to protect. But as I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly saved my marriage? Or had I simply buried the cracks deep enough that they wouldn't show? The answer, I realized, didn't matter. Life wasn't about perfection. It was about the choices we made and the consequences we carried. And for now, I was content to carry mine. The months that followed felt quieter, but not entirely peaceful. Derek's absence left a void, not just in our home, but in the emotional space he had occupied within me. I clung tightly to my routines, using them as a salve for the moments when my thoughts strayed to places they shouldn't. David seemed to sense my effort. He became more present in ways I hadn't realized I needed, coming home earlier from work, suggesting we spend more time together. He even started making plans for our future, talking about vacations we could take or hobbies we might try as a couple. It was as though he had taken a step closer to me, even as I carried the guilt of how close I had come to stepping away. But despite his warmth, there were nights when I woke up in the dark, the weight of Derek's gaze still vivid in my mind. I would roll over and watch David sleep, his face peaceful and unaware of the emotional battle raging beside him. I wished I could take comfort in his presence, but the shadow of what almost happened lingered, an invisible wall between us. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through some old papers, I came across a photo from years ago. It was the three of us, David, Derek, and me, standing together at some long-forgotten event. Derek's arm was slung casually over David's shoulder, both of them laughing. I was off to the side, smiling but slightly out of focus, like an afterthought in the frame. I stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the lines of Derek's face, the easy confidence in his posture. It was strange seeing him like that, just a friend, before everything had become so complicated. A part of me longed for the simplicity of that time, before I had to carry the weight of unspoken truths. Without thinking, I tucked the photo into a drawer and closed it. Some memories, I realized, were better left hidden. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of our lives. David and I found a new normal, one built on quiet gestures and unspoken understanding. We didn't talk about what had been bothering me those months ago, and he didn't ask. Maybe he didn't want to know. Or maybe he already did. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, David reached for my hand. His touch was steady, grounding, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't pull away. "I'm glad we're okay," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. "Me too," I whispered, and I meant it. In that moment, I let myself believe that we were, that we could be. But life isn't a neat story, tied up with a perfect ending. There are cracks in every foundation, and though we do our best to patch them, they never truly disappear. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, I would feel them. Hairline fractures running through the life I had rebuilt. They didn't hurt, exactly. They were just there. And yet I chose to stay, not because it was easy, but because it was what I wanted. Because love, I had learned, wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, even when things were messy, even when the weight of what could have been lingered in the air. When I woke up to find my husband's best friend in bed beside me, my world shifted in ways I never thought possible. Was it an innocent mistake, or the start of something far more dangerous? What do you do when temptation sneaks into your life, threatening to unravel everything you've built? Before we dive into this gripping tale of secrets, desire, and the choices that define us, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that pull back the curtain on life's forbidden moments. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Derek would always be a part of my story, a chapter I couldn't erase, but he was just that, a chapter. And though I sometimes wondered what might have happened if I had chosen differently, I knew the answer wouldn't change where I was now. As I lay in bed that night, David's steady breathing beside me, I closed my eyes and let the quiet wash over me. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for now, that was enough. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything, I realize life isn't a series of clean, decisive moments. It's messy, layered, and full of contradictions. I've replayed that night in my mind more times than I care to admit, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when things went from harmless to dangerous, from casual to meaningful. Maybe it was when Derek first looked at me with something more than friendliness. Or maybe it was long before that, in the quiet moments, when David's absence left an ache that I didn't want to acknowledge. Derek was a spark in a life that had started to feel dull, a reminder that I was more than a wife, more than the sum of my routines. He saw me in a way I hadn't been seen in years, not as someone dependable, someone expected, but as someone desired. And as much as I hate to admit it, part of me will always be grateful for that. Not for the tension, not for the guilt, but for the reminder that there was still life inside me, still fire. But desire, I've learned, is fleeting. It burns hot and bright, but it doesn't sustain you. Love, real love, is quieter. It's imperfect and messy and full of cracks, but it's also steady. It's a choice you make every day, even when it's hard, even when it's complicated. I've made that choice with David, and though it hasn't always been easy, it's the one I'll keep making. I think about Derek sometimes, though less often now. I wonder if he ever found what he was looking for, or if he's still searching. I hope he has. I hope he's found a place where he feels seen and whole, because as much as he brought turmoil into my life, he also brought clarity. He made me see the cracks I was too afraid to face and forced me to decide what really mattered. David will never know the truth of what almost happened, and maybe that's for the best. I've learned that some secrets aren't meant to be shared, not because they're harmless, but because they serve as a reminder of the choices we've made. The choices I've made. I've chosen my marriage. I've chosen David, not because it's perfect, but because it's real. Because in the quiet moments, when the world feels heavy and the cracks in the foundation seem too deep, it's his hand I reach for. And it's his hand that steadies me, reminding me that love isn't about being unbroken. It's about holding on, even when the pieces don't fit quite the way they used to. And as for me, I'll keep moving forward. I'll carry the weight of what almost was, not as a burden, but as a lesson, a reminder that life is full of choices, and sometimes the hardest ones are the ones that matter most. Wherever Derek is, I wish him peace. As for me, I've found mine. It isn't perfect, and maybe it never will be, but it's mine, and that's enough.